Hi, Jonathan. I thought I would share something I took from your recent podcast sessions in looking at the leaders that you interviewed and trying to find whether there was commonality across their comments and their views and their ideas and their approaches and their experiences. Um, and I thought I'd share it with you, but as ever with these sort of things, it went on longer than I expected, and I've created sort of three videos here. One sets the scene um, of those leaders, the context in which they come from. Then I'll move into some analysis, the easier part actually, of picking out their lessons that they've learned as they went along, and then finally I tried to look at how that applies today, both in terms of whatever occurs back when we go back to some sort of normality and in the COVID experience. No other reason than altruistic, really, in that, as you know, I'm passionate about the subject and I just wanted to see whether I could increase my own leadership ability by taking on board what they said. And bear with me as I go through this because I've got a script as I'm scrolling down, so I might become a bit wooden as we go through this. But first point I'd start with is a quote, really. I will hold McClellan's horse if he brings me victories. And they're words uttered by President Abraham Lincoln after he, as Secretary of State and aide, waited for over an hour in the house of General McClellan, George McClellan, his senior military leader during the US Civil War, only to have the general return from his duties, pass by the parlour that they were in, go upstairs, and an hour later, the president was informed that McClellan had gone to sleep. Now, Lincoln's comment to me reflected two of the specific characteristics that are writ large by many of the leaders interviewed by yourself. The focus for Lincoln at the time was on leading the Union forces to victory. And he also knew that the means to do this was through his army. And whilst his army commander had an overinflated and unjustified opinion of his own abilities and was rude in the extreme, to Lincoln it didn't matter. What was important was for Lincoln to serve the greater good, even if it required him to be snubbed along the way. And as you and many others now realize, Lincoln was an enduringly good leader, whereas McClellan is perhaps only known to those who study the Civil War. And by the way, he was sacked. The vignette is just a small sample of how leadership lessons of today, as expressed in the podcast series, are often not new in their constituent parts, but they may simply be painted by a different color because the context is different. And this comes out massively in your podcast series. Moreover, it captures just two of the many attributes and actions of successful leaders of today. I mean, your interview series, I looked at about 40 leaders from across the public and private sector, many of whom have also concurrently worked in both the voluntary sector and subsequently some have been in both sectors. And by looking at those leaders, what you've provided there is an endless pit of nuanced and specific leadership lessons and tips. And for those who are watching this video, I would absolutely encourage you to listen to them because what I'm going to do is be generic in nature in my lessons, and the real richness is in listening to the personal circumstances. As I said, I decided to use my COVID lockdown time to go back over each of the discussions, see if I could improve my own leadership approach, and I actually got far more than I expected and anticipated. It reinforced lessons I already learned and reminded me of some dormant knowledge and common experiences. But importantly, it gave me some new insights into the subject and practices of leadership. Perhaps, and as to be expected, the backgrounds of the leaders differed, but there was a huge degree of common and enduring insights and lessons. So, as I said, I'll start by looking at the leadership attributes and actions seen as being portrayed by good leaders from the perspective of those you interviewed. And I'll do this in a framework that is used within the army of what leaders are, what they know, and what they do. And then I'll try and provide some evaluation as to what it means today and in the future. As I said, necessarily, when seeking commonality of view, my analysis is generic in nature. And as I said, just listen to the podcast. That's where you pick up all of the nuance and colour. I would say, though, in using the group as a cohort from which to gather lessons, it's also worth acknowledging that the leaders generally came from operating in service industries or the military, given that they all, this comment, this will colour their comment and shape their approaches. That doesn't make it a problem, doesn't make it a negative. It's just that, perhaps a follow-on series may pick up areas such as manufacturing industry, family backgrounds, and perhaps really, really important, what the perspective of the followers are. How do they view what is, does it link with what leaders are thinking and seeing? And I know you absolutely rightly seek in your discussions with people to pull out the areas where people have gone wrong and made errors. And these are fascinating insights. But of course, the leaders that you've interviewed are people who have gone on to be successful. And therefore, those lessons or those errors haven't been catastrophic, well, thankfully, anyway. I offer these, they are tentative caveats, simply in recognition that some of the lessons will have nuance bias. Nevertheless, this group of leaders collectively offers around 1,200 years of leadership experience, and therefore they offer a fountain of knowledge from which we'd be foolish not to drink from. So, okay, so before launching into some loose categorization and specific lessons, that's I'd say that by and large, the leaders are in the latter stage of their leadership journey, not all, but most of them, and implicit in that journey, it follows a kind of sinusoidal curve. Nobody really mentions it apart from one, but their comments indicate a leadership journey that has generally started with enthusiasm and specific problems and dealing directly with people, regardless of the size of the organization. Then it enters a period of grappling with issues for which the problems and answers were complex and a struggle for them, before entering a more strategic and conceptual phase, often distant from those who are being led. And it was neatly categorized by the retired General Rob Baxter for him as a journey of direct, trust, and nudge phases. Now, that might not apply for everybody, but it's recognizing there's this sinusoidal wave going on of our leadership journeys. The consequence being they needed different approaches, different lessons, and it's adapted dependent on the size of the organization, where you sat in the organization, the external context, and the desired effect. It's a great lesson. Not only does the context of leadership change over time, so does the position of the leader within the context. Therefore, what seems to be coming from the leadership series is a leader is faced with a journey where the environmental context changes, the leadership position changes, and the journey has unique challenges in each phase. Thus, and as comes out very strongly in the interviews, leaders cannot expect to go through a leadership journey without being flexible in style and approach. Importantly, they all implicitly stress the point that style and approach may need to change, but consistency and the fundamentals need to remain constant. And it's a massively strong lesson for all of us, and particularly for those who are possibly seeking to template leadership. In many respects, they offer a view of leadership akin to that which we in the military apply to warfare, in that the nature of conflict remains the same, but the character changes. So it appears to be the same in the case of leadership. The character of leadership adapts to the contextual changes, and the nature of leadership remains constant regardless of context. It's the former that provides effective leaders with the ability to roll with the blows, to spot the opportunity, and to use diversity. It's the latter that provides the glue that engages with the emotions of people and includes aspects such as fairness, honesty, value, embracing diversity, etc. I think the most surprising and illuminating fact that came from the amalgam of stories, and this really is surprising, well, it was for me anyway, was that nearly all of the leaders had overcome at least one significant, if not more, life-changing hurdles. Between them, they had experienced war and death, life-threatening ill health, early and hugely impactful loss of a parent, bankruptcy and consequent life change, and very poor starts in life. And yet they all bounced back. And today, rather bizarrely, I was reading the Times, and there's Matthew Parris making exactly the same point. And it's perhaps why they also stress the value and importance of leaders with characteristics of humanity and humility. Their view being that without these, a leader loses connection with those they seek to lead and motivate. However, interestingly, and perhaps as a consequence of their life stories as well, humanity and humility is not exclusive from competitiveness and a will to win. It was obvious in their comments and emotion that they have drive, energy, and a desire to do well for themselves and for others. But it is not at all costs, as will be shown. This focus on humanity and humility was often expressed in a widely held view that every individual in an organization has potential. However, it sometimes requires leaders to reach in and unlock the potential because the individual may not be able to do it for themselves or may not know that they have potential. I have to personally admit that I was very warmed by this because it's a view that I hold very dear myself and one from which I've personally benefited, as indeed of others in the series. The view is more noticeable but not unique in organisations that have a long-term view, such as the military. The consequence of a bottom-loaded talent management system, such as that occurs in the military, means there is an expectation of people growing in roles and thus need support and guidance as opposed to being recruited to a specific output. The other clearly apparent point made by nearly all the leaders was the importance of parental influence and/or the first manager leader they encountered during their fledgling adult life. Parental influence, whether from a socially comfortable or uncomfortable background, is enormously powerful in their lives. Additionally, the first manager leader they encounter appears to have had an exponential impact on their own development or their own views. Needless to say, because they are successful leaders, they generally had positive experiences in both domains. However, it begs the big question as to how can society create an equivalent or balancing parental effect when it does not exist, as we know is the case across large numbers of young people. I'll leave that one hanging because it's such a huge subject. The second aspect of the first manager leader and the influence that person had offered a consideration that had certainly not occurred to me in the past. To use a business term, how do we train the onboarding leaders? If the first experience is so powerful, then it is in the interest of a business or organization to think extremely careful as to where new talent is placed and with whom. Furthermore, that leaders in those initial positions understand the exponential impact they can have and how they can maximize the opportunity for the individual and the organization. That finishes the first video in the three. I'll move on into the next, really getting into the specific generic common lessons and views of what good leadership looks like from the amalgamation of all of those interviews. So bear with me while I switch videos.